Hi, my name is Cindy Rang with the Fabric Patch in Ephrata, Washington at www.fabricpatch.net, and this is our 11th class in our row sampler series. So what we talked about last time was deciding how you wanted your rows to go and deciding how big you need your applique block to be. So I'm going to show you the one that I've been working on along with you. I'm just going to hold it up. Mine looks like this. So you can see that I put my rows in a little different order, and then I went down, went down, went down. And so what I'm going to do is I know the space that I need for my applique blocks, and I'm actually going to put 2 applique blocks. I don't know if you noticed, but I put also an additional small row of the flying geese in mine, so mine will be a little bit unique. And that's the whole idea, is that everybody's is unique in the colors that you choose, the design that you choose, the layout that you choose. And that's why I'm really excited about this week's block, because this week's block is the applique block, and there are a lot of options in terms of creativity with what you can do. So we're going to talk about this. And then next week, we'll have a bonus border that we're going to talk about. And so once you get this done, if you still feel like your quilt is a little bit too small and you want to make it bigger to fit your bed, that's what we're going to talk about next week. And then we'll finish up with machine quilting, binding, and a label. So let's talk about applique. We are specifically going to talk about fusible applique in today's class. For those of you that have been quilting for a while, if you do hand applique, you certainly could do that with this pattern, but that's not really what we're going to cover. I'm going to show you one tiny little step about that, but if you want to, we do have a hand applique or freezer paper applique YouTube video, and you could do it that way. You can find those, but today what we're specifically going to talk about is fusible. So let's talk about the products that you're going to need. So first of all, when it comes to Fusible web is a product, and there are lots of brands within that. So it's sort of like cereal. Cereal is a thing, and then you can get Kellogg's or General Mills or whatever. So for Fusible web, there's lots of different brands out there. I'm just going to tell you that for me personally, I tend to like Steam-A-Seam. I just like it because it's affordable, it's consistent, it comes in a lot of sizes. I never have to worry about it. I'm just familiar with it. There is another one out there, and it's called Heat and Bond. Heat and Bond has also been around for a long time. Heat and Bond works great. The only difference with Heat and Bond is that there's only one paper, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute. But one thing I want to mention about Heat and Bond is there is a product called Heat and Bond No Sew. I don't know if you can see that on this or not, but if it says No Sew, you probably really will not want this for this product, because No Sew means exactly that. If you're doing a project for like maybe a tote bag or a pillow or something that you think is really not very washable or not going to be washed, and you don't want it to lift up on the side, then this is a permanent glue. But Fusible web as a general rule is not. And it's funny that on the directions it says that it's permanent, but it's not. The truth is, by the time you've washed it, on about your 3rd washing, those edges will start to lift up a little bit. It really doesn't fray too much, but it'll start to lift up, and it's going to cause you some trouble. So we always tell people to go ahead and stitch it down, and we'll talk about that at the end. So Steam-A-Seam comes in a couple different varieties. You can get it in the package, or you can get it in yardage. And so there's light Steam-A-Seam, and what that means is that you really don't notice that there's any glue underneath the product, because of course that's what it is. Fusible web is something that is turning your fabric into a fusible piece of fabric. It's turning it into an iron-on transfer, essentially. So the light stuff, it's barely a whisper. You don't even know that it's there. Steam-A-Seam 2, I would not, oh, this is a heavy box. There's a lot in here. Steam-A-Seam 2, it's a little bit thicker, but again, if you're putting layer upon layer and tons of flowers and building something, I'm not gonna lie, it's gonna get stiff. But otherwise, for a project like today's, it'll be perfectly okay. Whatever you have is fine. The other thing that's nice about Steam-A-Seam, and possibly some of the other brands, is that they'll do it in printable sheets. So this is actually a 9 by 12, and the regular size of paper is 8.5 by 11. So what would end up happening is you'd probably want to trim it down just a little bit. But if you want to just put it through your printer, because you have something that's fairly large or something that's fairly involved, it'll print it on it for you, or it's just a nice easy sheet to be able to use. So a couple different ways that you can purchase it. So you are going to need a fusible web product, whichever one is whichever one you want to use. All of them come with directions, but I'm going to kind of tell you my tips and hints about it. One thing that you're also going to need, of course, is an iron. This is just kind of a fun iron. I'm going to admit it's kind of spendy. It's about 40 bucks, but it's really nice because it's tiny. It gets into those little grooves, and it gets as hot as a regular iron. Or if you have a regular iron, that's great. I tend to like a heavy iron, and I'll show you that in a little bit. It is possible that while you are using fusible web, you'll accidentally get some on the iron, and again, I'll show you that in a minute. And so this is an iron cleaner. I'll show you how this works. It's nice just to have some on hand. They're inexpensive. You get 10 sheets. 10 sheets is enough for you and 2 friends for a lifetime. You don't really go through them that much. So these are nice to have on board. The other thing is an applique pressing sheet, and this is just to make sure, this is really to try to protect the iron and make sure everything doesn't get sticky. If you are a beginner with fusible web, or you think you're going to be doing a lot of it, I would say definitely get one. I've been doing fusible web for forever, decades, and I still use a pressing sheet all the time. The other thing is that the non-stick needles are a nice thing. When we get to the sewing part and I show you that, you'll see that as we're stitching through multiple layers of fusible web, your needle can get kind of gummed up a little bit. These have a little titanium coating on them, and so they don't get gummy. And so you can stitch through everything, and even if you're stitching, if you leave that needle in and you do regular stitching, no one's gonna care, but it just isn't gonna go through the needle so quickly. And they're only $1 more than regular needles. It's kind of a nice option. And the other thing is a good pair of scissors. So what's nice about the titanium coating, so whether it's on the needles or the scissors, is it's sort of an it's like the Teflon product for us. And so these have a coating on them so that as you're cutting, your scissors don't immediately get gummy. And so you do want titanium, you do want something that has a nice cut all the way to the tip. The other thing is that both of these scissors have a little serrated edge, and I'll show you that when I'm cutting. And what that means, I think I've talked about it before, but it has just these tiny little teeth on them so that when you're cutting, it'll grip it a little bit and it doesn't slide. The only difference between these two, and I like both of them, this one tends to be the one that I use most often, but these have great big huge handles. So if you're somebody who has thumb arthritis or a little bit more difficulty, they just fit your hand just a little bit better. But they're both about $16, and they're nice scissors to have. All right, so we're going to go through all of the steps of fusible web, but what we're going to cover first is we're going to cover the biased stem, because what's happening with our project is we're going to create the back, we're going to put down our biased stem, and then we're going to put our flowers over the top of it. So we're going to reconfigure a few things, and then we'll be right back and cover that. All right, so we're going to talk about bias stems. And so the bias stems are, of course, your little underlayment here, and it's also, if you're going to do kind of a long rolling border like what I'm going to do, you need a lot of stems. It's important that they're biased because that's what's going to cause your fabric to be able to turn. Otherwise, fabric, if you're cutting it on the straight of grain or the weft of grain, it's not going to stretch and you'll get funny little buckles in it. So if you want something to just curve gently around your quilt, that's why it has to be bias. So it says bias binding because this is how we prepare it. So I'm going to take you through all of these steps because these steps, if you're a very visual person, this may not make sense. So we're going to go through this and I'm going to show you how to put your bias stems on. So what you're going to start with is a square. And I have an 18-inch square. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it in half on the diagonal. And so taking my ruler, taking my 45-degree mark, and lining that up easily, I'm just going to go ahead and cut that in half. I've already done that, and I have my 2 triangles. Now what's going to happen is I'm going to take this bottom, and I'm going to flip it over right sides together onto the top. And when I do that, I'm going to give, somebody asked in a previous video, what is a dog ear? This is a dog ear. It's just this little thing that kind of hangs over the edge. So we've got one on the side here, that's about 1/4 of an inch, and one on the side over here. Because then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew 1/4 of an inch in from one dog ear to the other. I'm going to go do that really quick and I'm going to be right back. Okay, so I've sewn this right sides together, and again, here's our funny little dog ears that we sometimes see. We'll end up clipping those off in a minute. And then if you open this up, again, if you look at your directions, you can see we've cut it in half on the diagonal, we flipped the one up, we sewed our 1/4 inch seam allowance, and now what we're doing is we're on the wrong side of the fabric. And we've pressed our seam open. Now I have to tell you that typically I don't press seams open. I tend to go from one side to the other. We've talked about that before. But for this, because you have a lot, you have small pieces that you're working with, you just don't want all of that extra bulk. So in this occasion, I do press that seam open. So now what you're going to do is you're going to mark the size of binding you want to make. For me, when I'm doing bias stems, my magic measurement is 1.5 inches. I'm fairly certain that's what it says on your pattern, but if you know, you can do a couple tests, you can see the size that you want. If you're doing binding, you of course would probably make it 2.5 inches. The only time I do bias binding is if I'm curving the binding. So if I have a scalloped edge or I have something round, maybe a table runner or a tree skirt, something like that. Otherwise, I don't tend to do bias except in stems. And so what I'm doing is I'm taking my 1.5 inches and I'm taking, we've talked about these before. These are those iron-off pencils. You get them in a packet. There's 3 different colors. I just choose the color that works best for me for my project. And when you're done, it just irons off. You do want to be careful to not iron before you're done. And the other thing is you never, ever, ever want to use ballpoint ink or gel ink on your fabric because it smears and gets everywhere. You could use a pencil, you could use a water-soluble marker. Now, when you get to the end, and in fact, let me just do this. So if I do this and I realize I don't have another 1.5 inches left, this is going to be the end. And so instead of drawing a line, I'm just going to cut. And so now what I have is, here it is, and I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. But since we want to do continuous, this is where what you're going to do is you're going to bring this over and you wrap it on top of each other, and so it sort of looks like that. That's what this picture is showing, is that it's right sides together. But then what you're going to do is you offset it. So see what happened is I brought this up, brought these together, and then I'm going to offset it. The reason for that is that I'm going to go back over to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew this together, and then you're going to see that as we cut, we have one long line. So I'm going to sew this and I'll be right back. Okay, so I have sewn this together. It has kind of a funky little look here, but you can see that what's happened is now my line, I'm going to hold this up close to you, starts right here, and then it kind of keeps going around. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to start right on this edge. Can you see that? I'm going to start right on this. Oh, did you go up close? Yeah. Start right on this edge, and I'm going to go all the way around. So I'm going to cut this. You could do it with a rotary cutter. I've seen people do it, but that just seems super dangerous to me. I feel like I can cut on a line just fine, so that's what I'm going to do. And also, you might be tempted to press that seam, but again, I know that my line is iron off, so I'm going to cut first, and then I'm going to press.
Okay. Hold on.
Okay, so there we are. So no waste, and you have this long strip. So the other way that people will do it is they'll just take a piece of fabric and they'll cut 45-degree strips. You can do it that way, and you can kind of tuck in a little one, a big one. You can kind of tuck them in and just make sure that they end underneath a flower. That's not a wrong thing to do. A lot of it just depends on what you're doing. For me, I really like the vine look. I really like what I'm going to make, and you'll see, is just a very long strand that I'm going to put flowers and leaves on. So there are other options, but for this particular technique, I think if you're a visual person, these pictures may not make a lot of sense, and so that's why I thought I would just show you start to finish how that works. All right, so however you've done your binding, your bias stem, again, my suggestion is a 1.5 inch piece. So now what you're going to do is you're going to go ahead and press it wrong sides together. And so one little comment about best press or starch. I like starch, but when it comes to anything where we're using fusible web, I tend not to use it. And the reason for that is fusible web doesn't like to stick to finishings. So it doesn't like starch, it doesn't like anything else, and if you find that your fusible web is lifting just a little bit, you might note what you're fusing it to. If you do have an opportunity to have a washed piece of fabric, that tends to work really well. That being said, I do not usually pre-wash my fabric. The reason that I don't is because if you're using a good quality, quilt store quality fabric, it comes with 3 different additives to it. One is a stain guard, much like carpeting and upholstery. The other thing is a sun guard, and so that's if you store your fabric in a pretty section of your sewing room, that way it doesn't have any sun fading. And the third thing that it has on it is just that little bit of starch, just to keep it kind of crisp and nice when you're using it. So if you're doing a huge fusible project and you know you're going to have a lot of layering, if you have the time to pre-wash those pieces and press them without starch, you'll find that things stick a little better, but you'll see none of my stuff today is pre-washed, and it's gonna stick fine. All right, but for this step, normally when I'm pressing all of this, I would use best press, but this time I'm not going to. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna fold this over, wrong sides together, and press it. And as you're doing this, since it is bias, you just want to make sure that you're not stretching it. You know what I mean? You can easily pull it. I tend to keep my fingers out of the way. I've been burnt enough to know, and I sort of know where my fingers are. But if you find that at this step you burn your fingers, there's those little thermal thimbles I think I've shown you them before. They look like this. You get 3 different sizes in there, so it'll fit a thumb, a finger, so that if you want to make sure that if your finger accidentally hits the iron, you won't get burns. So that's what they're for. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and press this. It's a long piece, and so it certainly would go faster on a full-size iron, but we can speed it up so you don't have to watch paint dry. Okay, so here's all of my bias stem. We're going to talk about size in just a minute when I show you, but we're going to sew 1/4 inch and then fold it over on top of each other. And so we'll talk about math if you feel like you want your stem to be bigger or smaller, and we'll review that. So for a minute, let's talk about the size of block we're going to be using. So when we talked last month, I had mentioned that you needed to know what size this block was going to be because we have to decide what's going to fit in there. And again, when I held mine up, I showed you that I did 2 of the migrating geese panels, and I'm going to do 2 different applique blocks. And so one of my applique blocks is this size, which I think was, it was 10 by 20. And then I have another one that I'm going to do, and it is going to be 9 by 25. This one is just going to be a small vine with some stuff on it. I'll show you how to do that one. And then the other one is going to be similar to this. So if you have looked through your pattern, you've noticed that the only thing that you've been given is all of the cutouts for all of these pieces. You've not been given this part. So I just want to show you how this is constructed. I'm going to move this stuff out of the way. Part of the reason that we didn't review this in the pattern is because we didn't know what size this was going to be. We can tell you what size to cut this, but we didn't want somebody whacking something off or, doing something to make everything fit. The whole reason for this is an opportunity to bring everything together the way that you want it to. So for me, I started, since mine is going to be 9 by 25, I've started with a piece. This is 10 inches, and then these are my bottom pieces. So what you could do is you could start with a piece that's just an inch bigger in width, an inch bigger in length, and you could even do a fusible pot if you'd like to. So the same way that we're doing everything else, you could do the same thing for your pot. But a really easy thing, and if you can tell right here, is you can just sew it right in if you'd like to. So if you tend to be a little bit brave, all you have to do is, my pot is going to be just this little short black pot, and all I did was I cut off a piece. I think that this is 6 inches. Let's see. Yeah, this is a 6-inch pot, and I'm just going to fold it in the middle. And when I fold it in the middle, I'm going to come over so that I've got about a 4-inch base, and I'm going to go up to about a 5-inch width. So I'm just going to lay my ruler down so I'm right about on the 4-inch. And by that I mean 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Because it's doubled. And come up here to, oh, let's do 6. And I'm just going to cut it. And here's my pot. If you don't like that, you can trim it a little bit, you can fussy cut it a little bit, you can make whatever you'd like. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew my sides on that. And I think my sides, yeah, because this is my top, this is my bottom, and these are my sides. So all I'm going to do, and this is just an easy way to do it. I was talking to a couple different people that are doing the class, and everybody kind of said the same thing, is that there is so much math involved, and the math gets a little bit intimidating. And I think that is true, but if you just know what you want to end up with, there's things that you can do. Since this part is creativity and all you don't need to be nervous about it. So, you know, I could tell you the angle, I could tell you the block, I could give you the templates, but really what we want to do is we want to sew our background pieces to the side of the pot, and then we want to sew the bottom to the pot, and then this whole section to the top. So all I'm going to do is lay this on pieces that are big enough that I can go ahead and trim up later. And so I'm just going to bring this over, lay this on top here. It's probably about 1 inch bigger on the top and the bottom, and I'm just going to cut this angle. Now I would say beginners are probably going to realize that this makes it super simple. People who have been quilting for a long time are going to say, I've never done it that way, and you're probably right, because there's probably all sorts of rules that I'm breaking. But I told you my story last time. I just really like to sew. I like to play. I like to turn it into something different, and it kind of doesn't matter. So now I'm going to go to the sewing machine. I'm going to sew this angle right here, right sides together, and I'm going to sew this one right here, right sides together. I'm going to kind of watch just to make sure that I have a little bit of room at the bottom and the top, because then I'm going to press it and trim it to fit. So I'll be right back. Okay, so I've sewn that, and so now all I'm going to do is I'm just going to press it just to make sure that everything lays kind of flat. And then I'm going to trim this off straight. So all I'm lining up is I'm lining up the top of my pot. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the bottom of my pot. Happens to be 6 inches, that's just a happy accident, because I can see that I have a straight edge here, and I'll end up with a straight edge down here. I like doing it this way because the way that it comes out is always exactly right. Some people might not like this if they're not a little bit of a free spirit. The other thing is you're going to waste a little bit of fabric, because now what's going to happen is I'm going to decide where my pot is going to fit. If I wanted to put a rim on my pot, I would have added that to my piece before I did that first step. And so I'm going to decide if I want my pot to be in the center of the frame, the side of the frame, whatever I'd like, and then we'll sew that. However, first what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my my bias stems coming out, because if we look over here, what's going to happen is I want that bias to be tucked into that seam allowance. I don't want to have to stitch that very end right there. So I'm going to start there, but then after I have all of that done, what I'll do is I will, once all of this is done, I'm going to bring this up, I'll sew that on, trim off those edges, and then I have my bottom piece that I can sew on. That way, if I still need just a little bit of room, if something else has happened, every once in a while the math, something weird happens, I still have just a little bit extra here that I can trim off of the bottom. So I'm going to set this aside. We'll see this at the end. And now it's time for me to go ahead and do my bias stem. So this one is going to be my pot, and then this one is going to be my vine. They are close to the same size, but not exact. So what happens with this, if you want it to look exactly like this, just, you know, save a picture of this, do a little bit of a drawing, but nobody's will look exactly the same just because of the way that you're going to be cutting and laying things. So what I like to do is, again, taking my iron off pencil, I like to decide where my vines, my stems are going to go. So I might have one that's going to come up and curve around where the bird will sit. I'm going to have another one that's going to come up this way, another one that's going to come up this way. And so put these vines on where you'd like them to go. Make sure that they fit within your pot, right? If we've made the decision of how big the pot should go. Yeah, that looks all right. So just go ahead and add those vines the way that you'd like them. And then once you feel like you're okay with that, we'll do the same thing on this one. This one is going to be just a standalone vine. So I have my white one, and I'm just going to do this. And that's all it's going to be, with flowers and leaves on it. Something very simple and very different. So then we take this, we'll probably go to the sewing machine together because I'm going to show you how to stitch this down and how to curve it. So let's see, we'll take this one and we'll go to the sewing machine. Okay, so I've put my 1/4 inch foot on and I have my mark, and here is my bias stem. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut this so that instead of coming in this way, I'm going to cut that little triangle off. And then what's going to happen is I'm going to line this up with this line, and I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch. And you're just sort of watching so that you can see that as you're sewing, you're sticking with that line. It's nice and easy. It moves right with you. And again, whether you're doing stems or a vine, if you're doing this on a very long border that goes all the way around your quilt, it's really a very pretty effect. It always gets a lot of attention because it looks so difficult. And since it's bias, we can turn both directions without any trouble. You just kind of want to make sure that you're not pulling it. And anytime you have to stop for a minute and reposition anything, make sure that your needle is in the down position. The other thing too is some people like to put a stabilizer underneath their cotton as they're stitching. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Most of the time I don't. I just press really well after I'm done with this. But if you find you have a lot of puckering, then a stabilizer will work well. The reason that you use a stabilizer is because, again, you're torquing the fabric just a little bit, and it really doesn't like to be manhandled that much. Okay, so, oh, and that's nice. We're ending right at a seam. That's perfect. Okay, I'm going to go over, we're going to cut this, and then we're going to press it, and then I'll show you the next step. Okay, so this is what we've done, and you can see that now what can happen is as you fold this over, since we've sewn down the raw edge, as we come over, we have this nice finished edge on here. So what hand appliqueurs will do is this is when they're going to go ahead and take a matching green thread and just hand stitch that down. You can do that if you'd like to. What I'm going to do is once I've pressed all of this down, oh, and down here on this side, I don't think I mentioned that, I'm just going to clip this off. What's going to happen on these weird spots, if you have an end, if you have anything that's hanging over, that's a perfect spot for a flower. So you don't have to necessarily tuck anything in there. So what'll happen is I'm going to press all of that over. I'm going to go back to the sewing machine, and with an olive green thread, I'm going to stitch super, super close to this edge to get this whole thing down. You can finish it by hand if you'd like to. I tend not to. We're going to pause for just a minute and talk about the applique flowers because it's time to add those to our stems. So the applique flowers, this is one more step where you're just going to have to make all of your independent decisions for what sort of colors you want to use. This is an opportunity to bring in more color if you'd like, to use the same colors, to mix it up just a little bit. And of course, we've given you some flowers, some leaves, and even a bird, but you can put anything you want here. You can put words, you can put a snowman, you can put all kinds of things. At the end, I'm going to show you some other alternatives. I'm going to show you some extra kind of fun things and some other patterns, because this is just your opportunity to personalize this quilt in any way that you'd like. We're going to go ahead though and deal with the flowers that you've been given. So if we look at this, this of course talks about having that stem and having the stem sort of loaded with all of those leaves. This tends to be a fairly traditional pattern. I have to admit that for me personally, I tend to be a very asymmetrical person, so I'm never going to put my leaves, you know, exactly where they go, but you guys can kind of decide what you'd like to do. But for your pattern, this is the pattern that you've been given. You're going to take your fusible web. And again, the fusible web that I like has 2 pieces of paper on it. It's just less sticky, it's a little bit easier to control, and it's a little bit easier to reverse something if you want to reverse. And by that I mean, if you're going to, like let's say you're going to say Carl, you know, down the center of this quilt. Sorry about that. You're going to say Carl, and so after you've traced out your C, your A, your R, and your L, you might find that the whole thing is reversed. So that is one thing that you'd want to do after you traced it. What you do is you trace your L on this side, and then you flip it over, and you trace it on the back side so that everything is flipped. If that doesn't make sense, it'll make sense by the time we get to the end. All right, so we're going to take our double-sided, we're going to lay this over the top of our pattern, and we're going to trace these out. As many as you'd like. And the other thing is you need to use a lead pencil. A pen is not a good idea because this paper is a little bit waxy, and so if you use ink, the ink will skip all over the place and you'll end up getting it all over your project. So it does need to be just a basic lead pencil. So you're going to trace around and trace as many of these as you like. And again, that's why the copyable one is kind of popular, because if you don't like that tracing part of it, then you can just photocopy it on your copy machine. So I would just keep tracing, but for our purposes, we're just going to do something kind of small for a moment. So once we've cut these out, I'm going to make 2 flowers. that are going to be this pretty red sparkly color. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to peel this off. Now again, if for some reason I wanted to reverse something, what I would do is I would tip this over. I can see my pattern through it, and I'm going to trace the same thing on this side and reverse it and use this side. The only time you need to do that is if your bird that you're tracing is facing to the left and you really want it to face to the right, or you're making words and letters and you really want to make sure you can see the letters. That's how you would reverse it. For me though, all I'm going to do is I'm going to open this up, and when you open this up, what you'll see is you've got right in the middle here, this is your fusible web. So do you see that? It's just this sticky, weird webbing that's very, very sticky. If for some reason when you peel that off, if this stays to this side, just grab it and bring it over, because this is your waste piece of paper. This waste piece of paper is just to protect it, and again to use it in case you need to flip something. So it's all sticky. I'm going to put it to the wrong side of my fabric, and then I'm going to press it. And this is the part where if you get something a little bit off and maybe some of that fusible web has eked out along the edges, this is where it's going to get all over your iron. You'll know that because first of all, you'll smell it. The other thing is you'll have this funny little grippy thing that's happening, and it gets all black. So the way that you clean your iron is you take one of these out. Grab one. If you do get something on your iron, these look like a dryer sheet, but I'm going to tell you straight up, it's not a dryer sheet. So don't think that grabbing your bounce will do the same thing, because it doesn't. It just happens to be that that's what it looks like. So it's on this little tissue, and all you have to do if you have to clean your iron is you make sure that your iron is hot, and then you take this and we just put it on the edge of our ironing board, or in this case our ironing mat, and I'm just going to run it. See all that smoke, that cleaning? I'm sure it's probably something that I shouldn't be inhaling, but it doesn't have an odor. It's just cleaning my iron. And so, I don't know if you saw there was some funny little black stuff on there, but it's not there anymore. And then what's happened is I've only used that much of this sheet. So if I need, I'm just gonna put it away. And where I normally keep it is just underneath my mat. If I need to clean it again, I'm just gonna come down here a little bit, and I'm just gonna clean my iron again. And that's why I think I said in the beginning that one package of 10 is enough for you and a couple friends. I mean, I probably go through one sheet in a year, and so it's very inexpensive. So anybody who's been using any of that polypropylene fabric probably already has these. All right, so we've ironed this to the wrong side of our fabric, and now what we're going to do is cut this out. And again, this is where the idea of these little serrated scissors, titanium blades, this is where this comes in, is that what you want to do is just be able to cut on the line. And what I'll do is I might go ahead and get all of my fusibles done and ready to go and ironed and in this stage, and then I'm just gonna put them on like a paper plate, and then I can go ahead and sit out and watch a movie or catch up on something else, and I just sit with this and the paper plate in my lap, and I just cut everything out. It's kind of like paper dolls, just a little bit. There's something kind of relaxing about it. I like doing it. So you just cut everything out, all of these little waste pieces, and if you want to modify the sizes a little bit, just go ahead and do that. So like this one, you can see this is the size, but maybe I want this one to be a whole lot bigger. Or maybe I want it to be a whole lot smaller. If you really like a pattern and that's important to you, just enlarge your pattern, decrease your pattern. I have even made some fusible web projects using the artwork out of a coloring book. I'm not sure that that was legal for me to do that. I'm sure that there was some sort of copyright issue, but I wasn't selling it. It was for a child, and they really wanted a Winnie the Pooh quilt, and I did not have Winnie the Pooh fabric, but I have fusible web, so I could do whatever. So see, this was the size, but I just went ahead and made it just a little bit bigger. All right, so once you've done that, then it's time to go ahead and design. So what we'll do, we're gonna get our stem piece. Okay, I have my stems sewn on, and I just want to show you the whole pressing thing. So what happens is, I talked about this before, but what happens is there's a little bit of distortion because you've just got this flat piece of cotton and you've got all of this going on. So when you press it, you can use steam if you like to use steam. I tend to not be a steam person, but again, you don't want to use best press. If you use best press at this, even though you're going to want to, you'll find that your pieces don't stick as well as they should. But what'll happen is as you're pressing, if you feel like you can get it flat, and then as soon as you stop pressing, you feel like it kind of wants to wrinkle up again, that's what the interfacing is for. So for those of you guys that maybe bought interfacing for the first time for masks, if you have any of this left over, this is the fusible one. So it's fusible on this side, it's not fusible on this side. And so what I do is I'm just gonna put that down because that's by definition, that's what stabilizer or interfacing is it's going to stabilize that fabric so that it remains flat and it doesn't have that funny little bulge in it from all of that sewing. So I am fairly careful and I make sure that I'm not on that fusible side, but if something happens and I accidentally eke off over onto this, that's going to get all over my iron. We already talked about cleaning the iron. If you feel a little bit nervous about that and you're not sure if you can stay there, that's what your pressing cloth is for. And this is that pressing cloth. And I had mentioned I use it all the time. You can still see through your work really well. And that way if I'm over here onto places that I shouldn't be, it's not going to matter. The only thing to mention about this is it gets super hot. And so you do want to be careful and make sure that you're not touching it too much. Because it kind of helps to conduct the heat just a little bit. So anyway, so once you've pressed all of this, I'd probably keep pressing that a little bit. Well, maybe I still will. Let me just finish this up real quickly. Okay, so now my piece is not only flat, it's going to stay flat. And it's easy enough for me to get rid of that excess interfacing just by cutting that off with my rotary cutter and my ruler, and I can cut off all of my little edge pieces. So I'm just going to trim up my side here. I'll trim up these others later, because now it's time to talk about the design with all of the flowers. And I'm just going to tell you that this is going to take you a little while because you're going to want to design your garden just a little bit. And again, you get to decide the colors, you get to decide the shapes and the sizes and where you want everything to be. You can see that I've stitched these down, and if we come in kind of closely, I'll get my glasses on. I'll show you. There's a couple options. So you can see that once I've sewn that one on and I flipped that over, see how close I am to the edge with a matching thread? And I just like to stitch all of that down. The other thing you want to keep in mind is that you want to do the underneath stems before you do those top stems. And I'm not sure if you can tell or not, but I tend to back stitch. As I get to the end, I'm just going to back stitch over that end. There's a lot of stitching right there, but I'm of course going to put a flower right on top of that so no one's going to see that. The other thing that I wanted to show you is that I've got this piece and I've got this piece. These are the two that I'm putting in my quilt. and I still have this much left. So with my 18-inch square, this is how much bias I made. Enough for this one, enough for this, and this is how much is left. So you get a lot because, again, there's no waste. All right, so now we've talked about the bias stems. We've got the bias stems stitched down. We have these weird little raw edges. Now it's just time to decide where our flowers are going to go. All of these ones that we've cut up, we're going to take these off. And again, as long as you cover those weird edges, or if you have something where something weird happened, just, you know, tuck a flower over the top of it. Nobody needs to know what's underneath there. I already know that with this, I cut a bunch of leaves that were this color, and I know that I want to get a bunch of different colored leaves that I want to put on it. And so I'm going to add other colors. I might kind of change my mind a couple times with where a flower should go. I might add more color, and I'm just going to decide what I'd like. And what happens is it's stuck there, so if I lift it up, it's not going anywhere. But if I want to reposition it, I can unstick it and I can move it anywhere I want. Once I've decided and I know that this is exactly where I want, then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to take it over. I can put my pressing mat on it if I'd like to, my pressing cloth, but really I'm just going to make sure that I iron everything down. I might want to put some centers in here. I doubt that it's going to be this bright orange color, but I can put whatever I'd like, and then again press it down. Then my top stitching is going to be similar to what I did with my stems. The other option is to stitch all of this down when I do my long arm quilting, which is actually what I will do, but you have to decide for yourself. If you're not a long arm quilter, or you don't want your long arm quilter to do it, you might want to do your stitching. You might also want to even just do hand stitching on it. You have all kinds of options for finishing. This one, the same thing is going to happen. You're just going to take all of your flowers, you're going to decide what's going to go where, you'll redesign, add more color, add more pieces, decide where your bird is going to go. It just gets to be exactly what you want it to be. And you just want to make sure that you cover up anything that is a raw edge. And I always go back and forth and I add more color, add different color. I change my mind multiple times. So you'll get to see at the end what I ended up with, but I'll change my mind. I'll change my mind a lot. So I want to show you two more things before we leave. I want to show you some added things, and I want to mention one more thing. I may have mentioned in the beginning that when you cut with all of your adhesive, you do want to use your Teflon scissors, but every once in a while at the end of your project you'll get a lot of black gummy stuff on there. All you need is just a little bit of wool. This is 100% wool, and what'll happen is that lanolin in it, it'll just clean that off a little bit. You don't have to wash, you don't want to use soap and water or anything like that, any kind of adhesive remover. You just want to wipe it with a piece of wool, and that'll get all of that little gunk off there, and they'll be good as new. So just to review, you already know the size that you need. Make your design in here the way that you'd like it. Oh, and let me just show you, this now is how this will fit here. After I've kind of decided what I want to go there, my little flower pot is going to sew on the bottom, and this bottom part will be determined by when it's time for me to fit that in there. I'll know exactly what that size is. Okay, a few other things I just want to show you before we leave. One is a Fusimat. Those of you guys that have been doing Fusible applique for a while, you know that there's a lot of layering sometimes that we'll do, like the wing on the bird or the center in here. We might want to lay this over the top of our pattern and create our project. There's a Teflon baking sheet that's similar to this that you put on your cookie sheet, and when you bake, your cookies just spread out so that everything is nice and flat and kind of crispy on the bottom. This is the reverse technology. What happens instead of having this fusible kind of eke out on the edges, which you sometimes notice, what will happen is it keeps all of it underneath, so that you don't have any of that little funny little residue that you end up with even if you're careful. And that funny little residue is why I do tend to use a pressing cloth. So that's what a Fusimat is. If you do a lot of fusible web, it's a nice thing to have. You can lay it right over the top of your pattern so that you can see the pieces as you're putting things together. I just want to reiterate again the idea of the non-stick. If you're having trouble sewing these things down, it's because you need that non-stick. It's a little Teflon coated needle. Again, they're $1 more, but totally worth it, because as you do all of this top stitching, you don't want that gummy needle. I just want to show you a couple other fun things, because if you liked fusible web, there's a bunch of things that you can do. This is one of my favorite books. I love Kathy Doherty. We have a couple of fabric lines from her. Fantasy is her fabric line. So she's kind of cool. She's got kind of a quirky look to her stuff. And so she's got some great pictures in here, some great quilts, some good ideas, and then back in the back, she talks about fusible web. She talks about designing and doing your own thing, which I kind of like. And then she's got these great shapes, great things. Tree of Life, a bunch of fun little things, fun projects. So she's got some fun images back here that are some really cool flowers. So one of my new favorite books. Another pattern that we like a lot is a Frosty Night. We have a couple of her designs, so any of these fusible applique designs will work really well. This one is done in flannel. I know you can't really probably tell that, but this one is all done in flannel. It's all fused down. Oops, I got threads everywhere. It's all fused down. And then this one is hand stitched down. You don't have to hand stitch it. You can absolutely machine stitch it, but this one was hand stitched down, so it has just a little different look to it. But kind of a fun project, all done with fusible web. Cute. And then these are really cool, and you see these more and more, and these are laser cut fusibles. And so this is that same idea. If you were to go ahead and trace the pattern, iron it to the wrong side of the fabric, cut all of the fabric out, and be ready to go, that's what they've done for you. So you would make this little guy, and all of those pieces are prepared for you. All of them have been fused and laser cut, and they're ready to go, all on fabric. And so I don't know why I picked mostly Christmas stuff. There's quite a few different things. So these are kind of clever. They are a little bit more. You're gonna pay $14 for this, but it's because they did all of the labor for you. In terms of fusible web and fabric, you don't have that much involved, but they've also put the buttons and everything in there for you. If you're not sure what to do with those, or you like these ideas, you just don't want to spend the $14, she also has a pattern, and you can draw everything out yourself. And then she shows you, all she gives you is the fusible that you can put on whatever you'd like. You can put it on a towel, you can put it on a pot holder, you can put it on a shirt, on anything you'd like. She gives you the patterns for making all of these fun things, for a mug rug, a little pot holder, all kinds of different things that you can do with it. We also have quite a few laser cut snowflakes. We order these specific, and we've got them packaged for you. They are in pale blue, there's a dark blue, there's different sizes, there's a large and a small. We also had this kind of fun fabric, here's the large one, and they're in a couple different shapes. And again, they're laser cut, they've got the fusible on them. All you have to do is peel that off and you're ready to go. And so we had some really cool, this is a cool Hoffman fabric, and so we've packaged these together. So we have a dark one and we have a light one, and then all you have to do is put down your snowflakes where you'd like to, iron them down, and then you have a nice table runner. And you can do the thicker one, this fits my table really well, or you can do a long, thin one, depending upon the size of your table. The last thing I want to show you is something that's called broderie purse. Broderie purse is one of my favorite things to do, and what you do is you take just a cool fabric, whatever it is, and you put your fusible web on the back of that fabric. And then you take your scissors and you cut out around that image. And when you've cut out around that image, you have this little guy. And so you haven't had to do all of that work, and then all you're gonna do is peel that off, and you have this little iron-on applique that you can put on top of, I mean, maybe it's not gonna go on this, but it could go on anything you'd like. You can find there's different holiday pieces. I don't know why I picked a creepy Halloween, but you can do all sorts of things. And again, you can put them on bags, you can put them on cardstock if you want to make your own Christmas cards. We have some cool different images for that. So, and again, this is called broderie purse. It's actually an old-fashioned technique that has been made new again with fusible web. So it makes it kind of a fun thing to do. So lots of fun ideas, different things that you can do. Hopefully you've enjoyed your fusible web block. We really do want to see pictures of what you've put together. And next week we're going to talk about borders, and we're going to get it to the size that you want. There's 2 little bonus borders for you, so we'll see you in a week.